Okay, today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Ayin Gimel, and we're going to actually finish the 6th chapter today, which is a very nice thing. You should feel accomplished. We've gotten through 2 full chapters on sacrifices. Not always simple matters. Today we're going to also learn a bunch of new concepts that you might not yet be familiar with. So we're starting at the top of the page on the 3rd line, Shachato Shelo La'ochlav. So if you recall, we saw in the Mishnah, toward the end of the Mishnah gave some cases. If you slaughter it for the wrong people, right, for people who can't eat it, or shelo l'minuyav, or la'arelim, or litzmeim, all people who can't sacrifice the korban pesach. What do we say? Right? It's, if you do that, it's obviously a korban that can't be brought in the temple. If it can't be brought in the temple, well, if you did it on Shabbat, are you obligated, a korban chatat, because you did a malacha on Shabbat? Yes, of course you are. So that's what the Gemara is going to ask. Pshita, it's obvious you're going to be that you're going to be obligated in that case for Shabbat because you did nothing. You did something totally wrong. You weren't allowed to slaughter on Shabbat. So what did you do? So they say, Kevan dahatam pasul hachachayav, right? Why is it obvious? Because since the korban is pasul, it's disqualified, then obviously you're going to be obligated. Again, it was unwitting, but it was still, you're obligated to bring a korban chatat. That's what a sin offering is meant for. So they say, this is going to be one of those a bit long-winded things. Mishum detane sefa patur tane reisha chayav. Well, they actually brought that case only because they wanted to bring the next case. What was the next case? In the case where you slaughter it, l'ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav. You include some people who can eat and some people who can't. You include l'minuyav v'shelo l'minuyav, l'arelim u'litzmeim. Remember that Mishnah where if you include parts of a group that are problematic, but the other part is fine in these categories, it's okay. It's not disqualified. So if it's not disqualified, then what do we say? You're going to be patul. And that was what the Mishnah said. If you did it for those and those, then you're going to be exempt. So because they wanted to bring that case, they brought the previous case. However, that's why I said it's a bit long-winded. They're going to say that also is very obvious. If I bring a korban pesach that's valid, of course I'm not going to be obligated because I slaughtered an animal on Shabbat. I was allowed to do that. So that's what they're going to obviously ask. So now they say, Vahanami pshita, that's also obvious. Mishum dehatam kashil hachapatur. Since the korban is valid, therefore, right, there's an obvious equation between the korban is invalid, you're going to be obligated a korban chatat, a sin offering. The korban is valid, you're not going to be because you actually slaughtered the proper korban. So that's also obvious. So what do they say? Okay, forget that. The 2 cases at the end of the Mishnah were really only coming as a comparison for what? It was actually coming to foil the first case in the Mishnah, which was if you slaughter it in the name of something else, right? You say, I'm bringing the Pesach, and you slaughter it in the name of a shlamim, let's say, peace offering. Then what did the beginning of the Mishnah say? You're going to be obligated, right? You're going to be chayav a chatat. So now they say, therefore, tananami shelo la'ochlav. That's why they brought this case. They wanted to say also this case. So they're comparing the cases. But obviously, we're going to ask the same question there. A Pesach sheshachato shelo lishma, what do we mean? Right? What happens? It's a disqualified korban. If it's disqualified, of course you're going to be obligated to bring a korban, a sin offering. Haguf alamali, why do you need that case? So that's why I said this is very long-winded, right? And if we take case number 1, which is shelo lishma, case number 2, we're going to see in a minute. That's going to be finally the one that's important. Case number 3, which is shelo la'ochlav. Case number 4. So what we did was we need case number 3 for case number 4. Why do we need case number? Well, we don't really need case number 4 either. Why do we need that? To compare to case number 1. But why do we even need case number 1? Basically, cases 1, 3, and 4 are totally obvious. Because again, disqualified, then you have to bring a sin offering. Not disqualified, then you don't have to bring a sin offering. So now, see someone asks, is it patur balasur? I don't believe so, because here you're actually exempt because you didn't do anything wrong. You brought a korban, you slaughtered it, that was okay, right? You're allowed to, again, maybe you're not really allowed to, but it's fine, it works, your korban works. So I don't think you're obligated. I don't think it's forbidden, really. But it's a good question, I don't know. But now, so why do we need that one? So they say, obviously, it's going to be for case number 2. Okay, what was case number 2, right? So mishum de kabayli fluge Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. The whole point of case numbers 1, 3, and 4 in the Mishnah were to get to case number 2, which, as you notice, is the main meat and potatoes of the main core of our Mishnah, because that case was shar kol hazvachim sheshachatan l'shem Pesach. And then we get into a whole discussion between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Really, what we really wanted to get at was that one case that they all disagree about. And what's that case? It's where you take a different sacrifice, like a shlamim, and you do it l'shem Pesach. Because in that case, the korban is actually valid. You haven't fulfilled your obligation, but your korban is valid. However, what's the problem? You're not really allowed to bring a shlamim on Shabbat, but you were trying to do it as a Pesach. You thought it was a Pesach. So in that case, we're going to have a debate between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and that wasn't obviously a simple case, because if it were simple, there wouldn't be a debate about it. And all the cases are brought just to get to that case. Okay. The order is a little strange then. Why are case number 3 and 4 at the end if they were brought to explain case number 1, which was brought to explain case number 2? But okay, we'll take it at that. Again, these are probably better questions than the answer, right? Okay, Amar le Rav Huna, there's 3 sections to today's Gemara. So this is section number 2. Amar le Rav Huna bar Chinina leberei. He says to Rav Huna bar Chinina, Rav Huna bar Chinina says to his son, this happens very often, someone says, Ki aza lekamei de Rabbi Zreika, when you get in front of Rabbi Zreika, ba mine. Okay, I have the following question, right? He sends his son, we all send our kids to do errands for us, right? He sends his son to, says, when you see Rabbi Zreika, please ask him the following question. Here's a question that I've been struggling with. L'divrei ha'omer, right? It's a good comparison, right? We send our kids to do errands for us. They send their kids to find out questions, answers from the rabbis. So he says, this is what's been bothering me. It's like the same way we saw when they're in the middle of these hordes of people, right? They're talking Torah. L'divrei ha'omer, mikalkel b'chabura patur. This is a whole debate in Masechet Shabbat and Daf Kufav. There's a whole debate. If you remember, Shabbat, you're chayav generally for melechet machshevet, a creative malacha, doing something positive. If you injure someone, you draw blood, we generally say that's a malacha. But what if you do it only in a destructive way and there's nothing productive coming out of it? There's a machloket. Do we say, right, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, do we say mekalkel and chabura is exempt, or are you obligated? Because it's this, in its chabura by its nature is a destructive act. And the fact that chabura is forbidden, it's forbidden because the malacha of shochet, do we say only if it's for positive reasons? Or is it even if it's only destructive? So now, if you're the person who holds that if you're makalka b'chabura and you injure someone and it's just destructive, nothing productive about it, you're exempt. So now we have a question from our Mishnah. Why? Shachato shalola ochlav chayav mati ken. We're now going to have 4 questions, 3 from our Mishnah and 1 from a Braita. Okay, and that's this whole section, which is each time we're going to say, based on Mekalka b'chabura should be exempt, we're going to give a case where someone is liable. And why are they liable? All they did was something destructive. And each time we're going to have to come up with what was constructive about that act. So our case is a classic case. You slaughtered it for people who can't eat the korban, in which case the korban's disqualified. All you did was a shchita that was destructive. The animal's not permitted to be eaten, right? The animal's not, because it was sanctified. The animal's not permitted to be sacrificed because it's disqualified. So what are you going to do with this animal? All you did was destroy the animal. So what do they say? Tikkun, there is some sort of tikkun, which is, and if anyone who learns Zvachim might remember this, im alu lo yirdu. There's different categories of disqualified sacrifices. Some kinds are the kind that if you put them, let's say, I'm not allowed to sacrifice this animal, right? Which means I can't put the blood on the altar and I can't burn the imulim on the altar. But what if I already did it? Let's say I didn't know maybe, or I didn't care, whatever it might be. If I already put them on the altar, there's different cases. Some cases you have to take it off the altar because this is almost like despicable. We'll see this in a minute with a baal mum, a blemished animal. A blemished animal cannot go on the altar. So if somebody puts it on the altar, you immediately remove it. But this kind of animal isn't that disqualified because it was slaughtered for the Korban Pesach. And right, it was just slaughtered for the wrong people, for people who can't eat it. But it's not that bad that it has to be removed from the altar. So that means that when you slaughter this animal, you did fix it minorly. You fixed it in the sense that if you put it up, then you don't have to take it off. Okay? So therefore, you fixed it. Next case in our Mishnah, if it turns out it was a baal mum, again, you have to bring a korban chatat. So again, mati kain, what did you fix? You didn't fix anything by slaughtering this blemished animal. You certainly can't bring it on the altar. If it went on the altar, you'd have to take it off. So what do they answer? Tiken bedukin shabayin. This answer comes up a lot in a lot of cases, questions they have a baal mum like this. there's a special type of mum called a dukin shaba'ayin. Okay, of all the blemishes of the animals, there's one blemish that you could say this Mishnah is referring to. And it's basically really narrowing our Mishnah to a case. Again, this is only if you hold makalka b'chabura is exempt. The one who holds makalka b'chabura is chayav, you don't even have a question, and the Mishnah could be in any kind of blemish. But if you say makalka b'chabura is exempt, then you'd have to say that it's talking about a certain blemish in the eye of the animal. And not only do you have to say it's that kind of blemish, you'd have to say our Mishnah holds by Rabbi Akiva. Liba de Rabbi Akiva da'amal imalu lo yerdu. Rabbi Akiva has the approach that specifically that blemish is not such a bad blemish that if you put it up on the altar, you wouldn't have to take it down. And therefore, that's the answer to what case we can say our Mishnah is referring to. Traifor patur. Another case in our Mishnah. You slaughter it, and then you find out that inside, right, when you open up the animal, which you couldn't have noticed before, you notice there's some problem inside the animal. Wait till we learn all the different kinds of traifor. A lot of dapim about that. We have time, but you find out it was a traifor, which means the animal's not kosher, which means you can't use it on the altar. So now, in that case, you're exempt because you had no way to know that it was a traifor. So you're not going to be liable for desecrating Shabbat. Otherwise, right? If you basically make someone liable, no one would ever want to slaughter a korban on Shabbat, because if you did, what would happen, right? If you did that, you might end up finding it was a traifor, and then you'll have to bring a sin offering. Everyone's going to say, "Oh, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want to get involved in that." So you could see why. But now, what's derived from that Mishnah? Habigaloi chayav. If it was a noticeable traifor, meaning it wasn't in the inside, it was something you could have seen before you slaughtered it, then you'd be liable. Again, the same question comes up. Mati kain. What have you fixed in that animal? You took a traifor and you slaughtered it. You didn't fix it in any way. Well, you did, in fact. Tikain lahotzi midei nevela. If that animal were just to die on its own, it would become a nevela, and nevela carries a level of impurity. There's what we call tum'at nevela. The fact that you slaughtered it, it's true you can't eat it because it was sanctified already. You can't sacrifice it on the altar. However, it doesn't have tumah to it. It's not tameh because it didn't die on its own. You slaughtered it. So therefore, you've saved it from tumah nevela. So there is some sort of tikkun that you did, and that's why you're liable for Shabbat. Matkifla Ravina. So those were three questions from our Mishnah on this. If you hold makalka b'chabur is patur, why would you be liable here? In each case, we found some sort of thing that was positive, constructive that came out of this. So now Ravina brings a question from a different source. Okay, it's the same idea, same question, but not from our Mishnah. Ha detanya, the fact that it says in a Braita, Hashochet chatat b'Shabbat b'chutz le'avodah zarah chayav aleh shalosh chatot. Remember the people who get lots of lashes, lots of sets of lashes for doing multiple things? This is a person who does a number of things in one act and will have to bring 3 sin offerings. What did he do? He slaughtered a korban chatat on Shabbat. You're not allowed to do that because Shabbat you can only do the tamid and the musaf, right? The special sacrifices for that day, maybe a Pesach, but not a sin offering. You did it b'chutz. Where do you have to slaughter? In the azara. He did it outside the azara. That's another problem. And he slaughtered it with the intention of giving it to idol worship. Okay? Kind of the way he did this, I have no idea, but you're going to be liable 3 different sin offerings. So now, one of those sin offerings is because you desecrated Shabbat. But now what did you do? You destroyed this animal again. Makalka b'chabura is patur. So matikain, amar Rav Avira shemotzio midei ever min achai. If you hadn't slaughtered it and someone wanted to eat part of this animal, it would be ever min achai, taking a limb from a live animal. So you prevented it from ever min achai. Now you might say, okay, well, if I'm Jewish, I can't eat it anyway. What's the difference if it's ever min achai? So 2 possible answers. Either you've fixed this for Gentiles, who B'nai Noach, right, who are supposed to keep the laws, and right, all Gentiles are supposed to keep those laws and not eat ever min achai, so you've saved it for them, which is an interesting way to view the tikkun, in light of all sorts of things we've seen about their approach to, I would say, being aware of non-Jews, right, that all of a sudden we're saving non-Jews from doing this avera, and that would be a tikkun. Or maybe you would say that even for a Jew, having it ever min achai having it removed from ever min achai helps you, because ever min achai, apparently, I'm not sure if everyone agrees with this, or there's some opinions where everyone agrees. I read this very quickly, but ever min achai is forbidden b'mashu, even a little bit of it. Whereas otherwise, if you ate this animal, it would be kizayit. So you've fixed it to the extent that you're no longer going to be liable if you ate a little bit of it. In other words, in terms of eating it. So you've changed it. You've changed its status for your purpose. That now, if you ate less than a kazait, you wouldn't be liable. That's the tikkun. Okay. Anyway, that's an aside. That's our case. The rest of today's sugya. So again, what did we see today so far? We took this Mishnah and tried to explain. Some of the cases seem very obvious, and then we just said they were all brought to explain the others. Then we went to this question about if you say makalka b'chabur is patur, exempt, how do you explain our Mishnah being liable to bring a sin offering when you destroyed the animal? In each case, we came up with some sort of something that you did that actually was constructive. Okay, both 3 questions from our Mishnah and 1 from a Braita. Now we're going to move on to a different question. The Mishnah ends with this line, shachato v'nodalu. You slaughter the animal and then you find out that what? That mashku ba'alim et yadam, they decided to go with a different animal, or metu, or the owners died, or nitma'u, or they became impure. You're exempt. Okay, why are you exempt? Because it's to'eh b'dvar mitzvah. Now we're moving on from that. We're bringing a statement of Rav. What we're going to have here, I want to make it very clear because otherwise you'll get a little confused with all the back and forth. We're going to take divrei Rav. First, we're going to ask something on divrei Rav. First, we're going to assume something. Okay, we're going to deal a little bit with divrei Rav. And then we're going to eventually bring a Braita, not eventually, but soon, we're going to bring a Braita that seems to conflict with Rav. A Braita explaining our Mishnah. Okay, it's a Braita on our Mishnah. We often have that where we have a Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't tell us everything. There's Braitot that we're taught about our Mishnah to explain our Mishnah based on a Brait or expand on it, something the Mishnah didn't mention. There's a Braita on our Mishnah, and the conclusion of like something you can assume from that Braita, an assumption, seems to contradict Rav, what Rav says. And that's going to be our issue till the end of the chapter, which is going to end our daf. We're going to have 5 different answers. 4 of them we're going to reject, and 1 of them is going to still stand at the end. Okay? And each one we're going to classify into what type of answer is it. Okay, so let's start. Amar Rav Huna Marav. Rav Huna says in the name of Rav, Asham, and then to understand this, we're going to need a few new concepts. Asham shenitak l're'aya. Okay, there's a lot of, there's like 7 words here, and there's a lot to explain here. First, before I even continue, first, what's a korban hasham? Okay, a korban hasham is a guilt offering. You bring it for certain things, like if you steal and then lie about it, if you do me'ilah. There's a bunch of hashamot that you have to bring. There's 5 cases. Let's not deal with that right now because it's not important for our purposes. A guilt offering. Nitak l're'iyah. What does that mean? It means it was sent off to graze. What does that mean? What happened was I took an animal, designated it for my guilt offering. Then one of the following things happened. Either I died before I sacrificed it, and now the animal is stuck because it's sanctified, but it was sanctified specifically for an asham. Now you can't bring an asham for someone else. You can't just move it. Oh, it was my guilt offering. It has to be for me and I'm dead. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2 option is I lost the animal in the interim. I designated it. I lost it. I took a different one in its stead. Then I sacrificed that one. So now I'm of the status of nitkapru ba'alim. I already got my atonement. Now I find the original animal. What do I do now? The animal, again, was sanctified for a sin offer, for a guilt offering. I can't offer it, even if I did something else wrong. I can't offer for a different thing that I did wrong. And what if I didn't do anything wrong? Either way, it was designated for a specific guilt offering. I can't switch its designation. So what do? I leave it to graze. Okay, this is different, by the way, from a sin offering. If it was a sin offering, a chatat, I'd have to leave it to die. Okay, there's chamesh chataot metot, and some of those were these cases where you'd have to just leave the animal to die. In the case of a guilt offering, you leave it to graze, and then you wait. Okay, we'll see there's a machloket about this, but you wait until it gets a blemish. You then, once it's blemished, it can no longer be brought in as long as it's not blemished, it can still be brought as a sacrifice, and therefore I can't do anything with it. Once it has a blemish and can't be brought as a sacrifice, I can sell it, and we use the money, we put it in this kupa in the Beit HaMikdash. It was like a stucco box where people would put money for what's called olot nidava kates hamizbech. That means the mizbech should never be left without any sacrifices going. Obviously, only at night it was, but during the day, no. Even at night, they kept stuff burning all night. So if there were no sacrifices to be brought, they would put sacrifices on the altar. They would take money from there. They would buy korbanot olah, which all get burnt, and they would use the money for that. So that's what you do with it. So the asham basically turns into an olah ultimately, okay? Only after it's blemished, right? And it gets sold, and then it becomes a korban olah. a burnt offering. So now what does he say? So let's go back and read. Asham shenitak l'riyah ushchato stam. Let's say you didn't follow the rules. You sent it to graze, but then either you or someone else comes along, takes the animal, brings it to the temple, and slaughters it without any intent of what sacrifice I'm slaughtering it for. Now, what would you think? This was designated as an asham. It's an asham, right? And there's no such thing as an asham, right? But they say it like this, kasher le'olah. That slaughtering, if you slaughtered it, you can now sacrifice this on the altar as a korban olah. Bring it as a burnt offering. Why is that? Because, okay, so now we're going to read, alma kasavar lo ba'akira. Since what was going to happen to this animal once you sent it to graze, you waited for it to get a mum, a blemish, then you would sell it and use it for an olah. So it's already by default switched to an olah, even though you didn't, it doesn't need akira. You don't need to say, I'm switching this to a burnt offering. It happens automatically. That's what Rav says. This is going to be the problematic part of Rav, because the underlying assumption of Divrei Rav is that it automatically switches to an olah without you doing anything. Okay, so first they're going to ask a question. Okay, this is an aside question, not so central to the whole, to the next part of the sugya, which I already talked about, the Braita. But before we get there, we have one small thing to explain, which is Yihachi. Something in Rav doesn't make sense. He says if you sent it to graze, then it automatically goes to an olah. But Ihachi kiloni taknami. It sounds like if you didn't send it to graze, it wouldn't automatically turn into an olah. But why? As soon as it's no longer valid for an asham, it should be immediately it defaults to an olah. So they say, why can't it immediately default it? Only once you took it to graze does it count for an olah. That's gzera la'achar kapara atu lifnei kapara. It's because this is a case where the owners already received atonement, either because the animal got lost in the interim and they brought a new sacrifice, or they died. When you die, you are atoned. You're considered atoned. Your death atones for you. So they're saying they make a gzera after you already got atonement from a different sacrifice, because maybe you'll confuse it and think that even before atonement, let's say I have an asham to bring, I designate an animal, and then I decide, listen, this animal I want to use for an olah. If after I already received atonement, I could just easily switch it before I even sent it to graze, then you might think that maybe before I got atonement, I can just switch it if I want. We don't want people to think that. So therefore, we wait till I send it to graze, and only then where it's very obvious that this is not a regular sacrifice because it's already, something's different about it. Therefore, we'll let it happen. But if I haven't done anything yet, like sent it to graze, then people are going to confuse it. They won't know that how would they know that I already brought a different animal in its stead? They'll just think that I can just switch asham to olah easily, even before I received atonement. Umanatem, or where do we know that this is an issue? It says in the following Mishnah, Asham shemetu ba'alav, onit kapru ba'alav. Okay, here's our case. In asham where the owners died or they received atonement, yir'eh ad shiyaste'ev, that means you let them graze until they get a blemish. Now we're going to see a three-way machloket here, and then we're going to derive this halacha from one of them. V'yimacher v'yaplu damav l'nidava. That's the one we already learned, which is what happens when you sell it and you stick the money into the kupa in the Beit HaMikdash that was meant for the nidavot, for the ketz HaMizbeach as they call it, and it goes to there. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yamut. Rabbi Eliezer thinks it's just like the chatat, the sin offering. You have to leave it to die. There's nothing you can do with this animal. Rabbi Yoshua, and this is the opinion that we're going to be dealing with right now. Rabbi Yoshua Omer Yimacher v'yami v'damav olah. You can sell it and you can bring it for your own sacrifice. I can now bring a voluntary burnt offering to the temple with it. I can do that. Okay. It doesn't have to go to communal ones. I can bring it even for my own personal. Now, what does this show? He says you can sell it and bring with the money that you sold it for, you can bring your own sacrifice. This shows b'damav in aval gufo lo. It shows that you can't use the animal itself and just switch it. Why not? Again, the only reason he would say this, if he thinks you could still use it for yourself, so what's the difference? Why would you have to let it graze and then buy a new animal? It must be because he doesn't want people to think that I could just switch it normally, right? Now there you would think it's more likely people would confuse switching because I'm switching it from one sacrifice for myself to a different sacrifice for myself. So we don't want people to think that, and therefore we can assume that's also the case here. Okay, but getting back to the main issue is, Rav says, in Asham shenitak l'raya, shchato stam, you slaughter it without any intent whatsoever. We assume that that's for an olah. That's because, according to Rav, it seems like you don't need uprooting, akirat. You don't need to change it from one to the other. You don't need to do anything special. Eitivei Rav Chisda l'Rav Huna. Rav Chisda now brings our Braita to question. First, he starts with a quote from our Mishnah. If you slaughter it and then you find out that the baalim, the owners, left, or any of the other cases, right? They became tamei, right? Or they, what was the third case? The second case, actually, or they all died. So what happens? We say, patur, right? He didn't know it was a mistake. But that's not important for our purposes. Now, what do they say? V'tane Allah, there's a Braita about this that says, Bechol, this was all our Mishnah just talking about if you did this on Shabbat. Are you liable for Mechalel Shabbat, for desecrating the Sabbath, or not? But he says now, if you did this Bechol on a weekday, Ki Agavna, exactly the same case, what would you do? Yisaref miyad. If you took this animal and you slaughtered it with the wrong intention, right? You didn't know. You slaughtered it for these owners, and it turns out those owners are dead. So what do? Or whatever happened to the owners, right? They're not relevant for this korban. You have to burn it immediately. Okay, so now what does this have to do with anything? The first thing I want to remind you of is, what did we say? If you have a korban Pesach, if it's not Pesach anymore, what does it default to? It defaults to a korban shlamim. Remember that? Korban Pesach, not on the right day, right? We assume if you take an animal from Pesach and you slaughter it for the sake of a shlamim on a different day of the year, it counts as a shlamim. So now we're going to say like this. Now, burning, we're going to learn, you only burn things, although we'll see one opinion that says not, but right now, just assume you only burn, we don't like to burn sanctified items if we don't have to, right? Because burning it, we only burn them if they're really ruined. And ruined, what we call psul begufo, they're disqualified in their body, okay? Meaning, right, the animal itself is disqualified rather than, there's all different types of disqualifications. Some are disqualified from the outside, right, from something external. Some are disqualified internally. So let's see how that plays out here. If you say that this Pesach is, what's the idea here? You took this Pesach and you sacrificed it when it had no owners. You didn't know that, but it had no owners. If it has no owners, then it's not a Pesach. If it's not a Pesach, what is it? It defaults to a shlamim. So the question is, does it default automatically or not? So now we're going to prove it must not default automatically to a shlamim, because if it did, you wouldn't have to burn it. Let's see why. If you say, in order to switch to a shlamim, you need to uproot it. You need to say, I'm bringing this as a shlamim, and only then it would be a shlamim. Well, then, this case, what would happen? Hi Pesachu, this is a Pesach. So this didn't turn into a shlamim. It's still a Pesach. You slaughtered it for not owners that didn't exist, basically. And since it's ownerless, it's a psul begufo. The whole sacrifice itself is disqualified. And that perfectly explains why it's supposed to be burned. So that only makes sense, we're going to show, if it needs uprooting, which obviously disagrees with Rav. Because what did Rav say? You take this asham and you slaughter it stam without any intent. It's an ola because it doesn't need uprooting. Okay, so now we're going to see why this can't possibly be that it doesn't need uprooting. Yeah, why? I think I said too many negatives there. It can't possibly be a case where, right, I said it right. Can't be a case where it doesn't need to be uprooted. So ela iamrat lo akira. If you say it doesn't need uprooting, what will be the case? Me'resha havale shlamim. You didn't know this, okay? When you slaughtered it, you didn't know that the baalim decided to go with a different korban, but they did, which means that this, if you don't need akira, what happened to this animal? It's no longer a Pesach. It becomes a shlamim because it defaults to a shlamim, like Rav said. If it defaults to a shlamim, what will be the case then? What's wrong with this korban now? It's a shlamim that you sacrificed on your dalid, okay? It's a yom chol. We're not worried about Shabbat now because the Braita was talking about a regular weekday. What's the issue? You can sacrifice a shlamim on your dalid if you want, but what's the problem? Remember the beginning of Tamid Nishchat? What did we say? First, you have to sacrifice it before you do the korban tamid, and the Pesach is done after the korban tamid. So now you have a bit of an issue with this korban, but it's not a big issue. You wouldn't burn it for that reason. So psula mishumai mishum davar acher. The psul is not a psul in the korban itself. If it was a Pesach, right, that you did without its owners, that's a problem with the Pesach itself, which is why you had to burn it. But if you say this is a shlamim, what's the problem? It's just that you sacrificed it in the wrong time. You should have sacrificed it before the korban tamid, and now you sacrificed it after. So if that's the case, you definitely don't burn it. What do you do with it? Ibor tsurabai. Okay, I say definitely. We're going to see later. Maybe there is an opinion that you do, but right now we're going to say you definitely don't burn it. Truth is, maybe everyone says you don't burn it, but ibor tsurabai. What do you do with it? If you know, in the Shemitah year, we're getting to Shemitah year. If you use Shemitah produce, okay, you're allowed to eat Shemitah produce, right? But you're not. You have to treat it with sanctity because it's sanctified. And you can't just throw it out. You have to let it rot. And there's a big range of what people do, how long they let it rot. Do they just put it in a bag and it'll kind of rot in the bag in the garbage? Do they leave it out for a week until it's disgusting and it turns to compost like it? Yeah, there's all different options, okay? But the main thing here is that, and likewise here, ibor tzura, there's different interpretations. Rashi says you just have to leave it overnight. Others say you have to wait till it really rots, okay? The point is, you can't burn this immediately because it's not so disqualified. It's a matter of how disqualified things are. If it's a psul in the body of the animal, the sacrifice itself is really disqualified, like the first option, then you burn it. This kind of psul, you don't burn. So what do you see here? If it really defaults automatically into a shlamim, then you wouldn't need to burn this, right? You would just do ibor tzura, and that's not what the Breita says. So we're stuck. Okay, how do we know this? Titania, here's a Breita that says exactly that. Zehaklal, this is the rule. Kol shepsulo begufo yisaref miyad. If it's a psul in the animal itself, right, in the korban itself, you burn it. But bidamu b'baalim to ubar tzurato, if by accident the blood spilled, or if, right, there's some side issue, the owners died, then you to ubar tzurato v'yetzeh lebeit hasreifa. So then you leave it, and then only after that you burn it. Okay. So now we're stuck with Rav, who we assumed, who says stam, it's an ola, you don't need akira, versus this Pesach, which we said burns immediately, which means it doesn't automatically go into a shlamim unless you say so. It needs akira. So Rav says you don't need uprooting, it automatically defaults, and the Breita says you do, or the Breita assumes that you do. So now the first answer is going to be, let's change what Rav says, okay? That's the first option. Ela lo tema shachato stam kasher l'shum ola, ela ema shachato l'shum ola kasher. Why don't we just say, if you took it from where it was grazing, you slaughtered it in the name of an olah, that's effective. And maybe that's what it's telling us. And they change Rav and they say, to fit with the Breita, it must be Rav said this, which means it would need akira. So Alma by akira, right? So that assumes it needs akira, and then it works perfectly. What's the problem with this? Well, we have this statement that we already learned on Daf Samach, I think it was Samach Dalid. Le Rabbi Shiur bar Gamda, da Amar nizraka mipi achavura va'amre, kigon shayu ba'alim tmei metim, v'nidchim lepesach sheni. Do you remember we had that case where this Gemara assumed that it defaults automatically into a shlamim, and then they had this case where it didn't, and they said, why not? And they said it must be that case is a case where the ba'alim were tmeim, and then what happened? Because they were impure on Pesach Rishon, their korban that they designated for Pesach couldn't be used on Pesach, but it could be used on Pesach Sheni. And therefore, they saved that animal for Pesach Sheni. There you see, right, that Hayu D'bai Akira, but Haba Alma Lo Bai Akira. According to him, Ma'i Kalamemar. According to him, it sounds like we're still going to have a problem with our Breita, because that statement assumes that what? That a Pesach that you didn't use for Pesach defaults into a shlamim. The only unique case where it doesn't is if the Baalim are impure. The owners become impure, and then they save it for Pesach Sheni. But otherwise, it defaults automatically into a shlamim, which seems to imply you don't need akira. So why are we changing Rav? Seems like the Breita is an issue. So answer number 2 is obviously to deal with the Breita. So we're going to see different ways to deal with the Breita. Ela amar Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua, hacha b'may askinan. What's a hacha b'may askinan? That's what we call an ukimta. They're going to say the Mishnah is only referring to a very specific case. It's not every case, okay? Most cases do need, right? We're going to say, again, the Mishnah implies that you need akira. So now we're going to say most cases don't need akira, like we said before. But now, what if it does? So hacha b'may askinan, kigon shifrisho kodem chatzot, umetu ba'alim achar chatzot. So the case must be a case. Okay, this is what we're going to learn. There's something called dichoy by korbanot. It means if you had something, again, this is the whole world of korbanot, where everything is sanctified. It's going to God. Okay, just like we saw before. If you put something on the mizbeach, can you take it off or not? How disrespectful is it to God? If you have an animal that was good to be a korban, and then it got disqualified, and now it's back to being good, it's already been rejected. You can't bring it on. If this was a reject, you can't take a reject, even though it's now back to being okay, and use it because it was rejected already. That's what we call dichoy. Okay, it's rejected. So what do they say? They want to say this must have been a case of dichoy, and that's why it has to be saref miyad, because it was rejected. Okay, it can't be used for anything. Now, what would be the case where it's rejected? Has to be that it was valid to begin with. Okay, so it was hifrisho kodem chatzot. You designated the animal before chatzot. Meitu balim achar chatzot. Then, what has to be in this dichoy is first, when you designated it, it was valid. That's why I see someone talking about what about taking off the wart? That might be a case where you hadn't designated yet to use for a sacrifice. So it never had the status of it was ra'oi, and it was sanctified, and then it became rejected. To be rejected, something has to be already accepted. Okay, if it never was able to, then maybe you can make it able to. But if it was already able to, you designated it and you sanctified it before midday when you could actually sacrifice it. Then meitu balim achar chatzot, so it was valid when chatzot hit and you could do it. Then they died. So this was valid in the beginning. Then it became rejected. Okay, you can't do it anymore. Once it was rejected, you can't use it anymore. And that's why you saref miyad. But now they say, and then it becomes a psul b'gufo. It doesn't have anything to do with akira or not akira. Okay, and then we say, so this Braita doesn't even raise a question. But now they say, wait a minute. Midu tama ela Rav. We're trying to understand this according to Rav. Now, Rav has a unique opinion on this. Hama Rav, baalei chayim einam nitchim. He says dichoy only works when the animal's already slaughtered. If the animal's slaughtered and then something happens and there's a rejection, then it's a problem. Okay, but before it's slaughtered, it's not a problem. Okay, one of the examples they bring is the se'ira mishtalech and the se'ira chai, the two goats they use on Yom Kippur. So if once you slaughter the one in the temple and then the se'ira lazazel dies before, right, you take it off the cliff, then the one inside, since it was already slaughtered, it's rejected. But if it hadn't been slaughtered yet, Rav would say it's not rejected. There's no such thing as rejected. Okay, and then you wouldn't have to bring a new one. Anyway, there's a whole thing there. I'm not going to get into the details, but he holds the baalei chayim einam nidchim. Okay, they're not rejected. So therefore, this was all to explain Rav, and you can't say that was the case because it would have to be it was rejected before the slaughter and the animal was still alive, and Rav doesn't think that's rejection. So you can't explain the Braita that way to resolve his issue. So option number 3. El amar Rav Papa, hamane Rabbi Eliezer he. Okay, so first option was to re-explain Rav, right? Change his words. We rejected that. Second option was to say that the Braita is only in a unique situation. We rejected that because that doesn't fit in with Rav's theory on korbanot and dichoy. So now our other option is to say, oh, well, Rav doesn't have to match with this Braita because the Braita is a unique opinion. It's a unique Tanaitic opinion that not everyone agrees with. So what can we say? Hamane Rabbi Eliezer he. Now remember, the Braita is explaining our Mishnah. So we're going to say our Mishnah and the Braita together are only according to Rabbi Eliezer. Why is that? What's Rabbi Eliezer say? So Rabbi Eliezer says, Damar kol chena shochet acharim l'shem Pesach pasul dahavi le psulo b'gufo. What did we say? Until now, we've been saying all the time, when we learned lishma lo lishma, a Pesach that you sacrifice l'shem something else is disqualified. But a different sacrifice, like a shlamim, that you sacrifice in the name of a chatat, let's say, is not disqualified. Okay? Now, what's the issue? So Rabbi Eliezer says, if you slaughter something else, l'shem Pesach, in other words, any other korban in the name of a korban Pesach, it's also disqualified. Now, the psul of Pesach goes in both ways. It's if you do a Pesach shelo lishma, or you do something l'shem Pesach when it's not. And therefore, what's the case here? What'd you do? Now, we were trying to show, Rav says you don't need akira. Let's explain our Mishnah that you don't need akira either. If you don't need akira, what happened to the sacrifice? If you don't need akira, what do we say? It's a shlamim. If it's a shlamim, what's the problem? Well, the only issue is it's not a psul b'gufo. It's a problem because you did it after the korban tamid. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you slaughter something like a shlamim, l'shem Pesach, what do we say? It's pasul. It's disqualified korban. So then what do you have here? You have a psul b'gufo. That's a psul in its body. That's a problem. That's why you have to burn it immediately. But that's a problem because what do we want to say? Our Mishnah with the Braita on is Rabbi Eliezer, but our Mishnah isn't Rabbi Eliezer. And we know that because Rabbi Eliezer, you might it might be Rabbi Eliezer in terms of that issue, but there's another thing that it says, which is, what did we say? You're exempt from a chatat in that case. Why are you exempt? Because ta'abid var mitzvah patur. But what does Rabbi Eliezer say? You're obligated in ta'abid var mitzvah, right? You make a mistake while you're trying to sacrifice, you're obligated. So you can't say that line is Rabbi Eliezer. So what's going to be the obvious answer? We're going to find a Tana who holds like Rabbi Eliezer about the lishma issue, and he doesn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer about ta'abid var mitzvah. And that's going to be answer number 4, which is the answer that doesn't get rejected. He was the son of Rav Salah the Chassid in front of Rav Papa, Kamei to Rav Papa. Hamane Yosef ben Chonai. It goes like the Tana Yosef ben Chonai Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. Yosef ben Chonai Omer, and here we're going to see his opinion. Hanishchatim l'shem Pesach or l'shem chatat psulim. Anything you slaughtered, just like a chatat and a Pesach, that if you do them shalom lishmam, they're going to be pasul. Likewise, you slaughter any other sacrifice in the name of a Pesach, in the name of a chatat, it's disqualified. Alma psulo b'gufo. Therefore, our case is a classic case. It doesn't need akira, so it's really a shlamim. But you did the shlamim l'shem Pesach because you thought it was a Pesach. You thought the people could eat. You thought the people were still alive. You thought whatever they weren't tamei, and you did it l'shem Pesach. So it's a classic. It really was a shlamim because the reality was that no one was alive anymore or whatever happened to them. And therefore, it reverted automatically into a shlamim, which matches with Rav, and now it matches with this Tana, and it's psulo b'gufo, and that's why mishum hachi yisaref miyad. That's why it gets burnt immediately, according to the Braita. But b'pture, when it comes to the issue of ta'abid var mitzvah, sever like Rabbi Yeshua, you can assume the Yosef ben Chonai holds like Rabbi Yeshua, and therefore we're good. But Rav Ashi, in any case, gives a 5th answer. So this is the only one that didn't have any questions, and that's why you'll see the bottom line of the sugya. They're going to say, go back to answer number 4, because everything else is rejected. Rav Ashi Amar. Rav, now, instead of saying, okay, the last 2 answers were the Braita goes by an individual's opinion. Now he's going to go the reverse. He's going to say Rav goes by an individual opinion. And whose opinion does Rav hold? Now, our Mishnah really holds it needs akira. And that's why it's still a Pesach, and that's why it's disqualified, and that's why you burn it. But Rav, who thinks you don't need akira, holds by unique opinion. What unique opinion is this? As it says in a Braita, Rabbi Shema ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer. If you had enough Okay, the first part isn't so relevant, but it means if you had enough time to check it out, right, and you didn't, then you're going to be obligated. Ta'abid var mitzvah, that's not really a ta'ut. You should have checked, right? You had enough time to check what's the status of the owners. You should have. But the point here is, if you did it anyway and you slaughtered it, to ubar tzurato v'yotzei lebeit hasreifa, you have to do ibor tzura, meaning you don't burn it. Here you see Rav must have held like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, who disagrees with the Braita on our Mishnah. So the Braita on our Mishnah doesn't raise a problem in Rav because he has a different Tana he holds like. So now, my time, why to ubar tzurato? Now they're assuming why to ubar tzurato for the reason you would assume based on what we learned today. Lav mishum de lo ba'ay akira must be because, right, if it was a Pesach, it for sure would be destroyed. It must be because it turned into a shlamim, and the shlamim is only a problem because of external reasons, because of you slaughtered it after the korban tamid. But now they say, no, you could say it's a different reason. The reason why Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka has nothing to do with akira. He still thinks it's a Pesach. Dilma mishum desaver la ketana de Rabbi Baravua. Maybe he holds like the Tana of Rabbi Baravua, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka holds by unique opinion. And I said something earlier today, and I said this is the case, but then I said not everyone is going to agree. Rabbi Baravua has a unique opinion. Tamar filu pigol nami by ibor tzura. The reason why you do ibor tzura is not because it turned into a shlamim, but he thinks even a psul like pigol, which is the most psul begufo, which would then be the same if it's a Pesach and it has a psul begufo, doesn't ever get burnt. He thinks those things to ubar tzurato, they don't ever get burnt. Okay, so it has nothing to do with morphing into something automatically without akira. No, it's for a different reason. Why does he say this? He learns it from notar. Notar by nature is already ubar tzurato because it was left overnight or over 2 nights, right? So notar, we're going to learn from pigol to notar. They always do because there's a gzera shava between them, avon. So they learn a lot of things from one to the other. And therefore, even pigol needs ibor tzura, which would mean also Pesach that's disqualified, you would need ibor tzura. And this is a unique opinion. It has nothing to do with akira again or not. And now he proves it. If you don't say this, if you think our mission is all because the saref miyad is because it went into a shlamim, because it automatically went into a shlamim, nitmu ba'alim ma'ika lememar. What are you going to say about the case of nitmu ba'alim? right? There's three cases there. The baalim died, right? And one of them is the baalim became impure. Now, what do we learn? If the baalim become impure, they wait till Pesach Sheni, which means it's not going to automatically go in that case, right? So, havadai by akira. In that case, you definitely are going to need akira. And you can't say that our mission means you don't need akira, because in this case, you definitely need akira, because even if it automatically, a Pesach that's disqualified automatically goes into become a shlamim, not in the case where you're impure. If you're impure, your korban automatically waits. It's in a holding pattern until you get to Pesach Sheni. If you default on Pesach Sheni and you don't do Pesach Sheni, then it can turn into a shlamim. But at this point, for that month, it's going to still be used for that. So therefore, and now in this point, you actually slaughtered it, but it doesn't matter. The point is, since you became tameh, it's theoretically supposed to be waiting for, and before you slaughtered it, it was designated still for its track, right, on the Korban Pesach track, and it doesn't go to a shlamim. So there, Da'amar Rabchia Bar Gamda, as we said before, right? It was said by the group. In that case, the Pesach stays as a Pesach, and you would have to have akira before the slaughter. You would have had to say, I'm using this as a shlamim if you want to count as a shlamim. So we reject Rav Ashi, Elam Mechuvarta Kedishana Meikara. So it must be the way we said it originally. Yosef and Chonahi. And with that, Hadron Alach Elu Dvarim, we finished the parak. So that last part of today was really just to deal with this contradiction between something that was inferred from Rav, something that was inferred from the Braita. And as I set it up before, I'm not going to go through all the details again. Each attempted answer was a different type of attempt. And I charted it out and specified it on the sheet also. So you can look back there for review. Have a good day, everybody.